The pristine marble floor of the Sovereign London Hotel, VIP Lounge, glistened like polished glass. Underneath the massive crystal chandelier, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Julian, the chief culinary director, stood with his face flushed crimson. His fine silk necktie was slightly crooked, and his eyes burned with pure malice. In front of him stood Kofi, an African room attendant in a faded black server uniform. Kofi's hands were trembling slightly, but he kept his head low and his back straight. Julian raised his hand and violently struck the silver tray Kofi was holding. Clatter! The porcelain teacup shattered into 100 jagged pieces across the immaculate floor. Hot tea splashed across Kofi's dark trousers and worn leather shoes. "You useless, ignorant ape," Julian roared, his voice echoing through the high-salient lounge. A delegation of high-ranking South African foreign diplomats stopped dead in their tracks. Julian pointed a trembling, rage-filled finger directly at Kofi's face. "Do you have any idea what you just touched?" Julian sneered, his lip curling in disgust. "That was hand-picked Royal Imperial golden tea, worth $10,000 a kilogram." Kofi slowly lowered his eyes to the steaming puddle on the marble floor. He did not yell back. He did not raise his fists. He simply knelt down and began picking up the sharp porcelain shards with his bare fingers. "I am sorry, mister." "Julian," Kofi said softly, his English quiet, thick, and measured. "I only meant to check the water temperature." The leaves were scorching. Julian let out a harsh, mocking laugh that cut through the quiet room. "Check the temperature? You?" Julian stepped closer, leaning down to hiss in Kofi's ear. "You came from a dirt hut in the bush 3 months ago. You clean toilets and carry trash bags. How dare you pretend to know anything about the luxury of high society?" The diplomats watched in uncomfortable silence, but no one stepped forward to intervene. To them, Kofi was just another invisible worker in a golden palace. Julian took a step back, straightening his expensive suit jacket with a satisfied smirk. "Get on your knees and clean up every drop of this mess before I call security," Julian ordered. "And if there is a single mark on this floor when the president arrives, you're fired. You won't just lose your job, Kofi. I will make sure you are deported back to the dirt you came from." Kofi's fingers tightened around a piece of broken porcelain, pressing so hard the sharp edge cut his skin. A tiny drop of dark red blood welled up on his thumb, but he felt no physical pain. His heart was pounding violently inside his chest like a trapped bird. Losing this job meant losing everything. Back in a cramped hospital room in Cape Town, 6-year-old Amara was waiting. Amara had a severe, congenital heart defect that was slowly starving her young body of oxygen. The specialized surgery required to save her life cost 45,000 British pounds. Every single penny Kofi earned working 14-hour shifts went directly to the hospital clinic. If Julian fired him today, the hospital would cancel Amara's emergency surgery next week. His daughter would die because an arrogant director wanted to parade his authority. Kofi swallowed the bitter taste of humiliation rising in his throat. "Yes, sir," Kofi whispered softly, bowing his head deeper toward the cold floor. He reached into his jacket pocket with his uninjured hand, his fingers touching a small leather pouch. The pouch was made of worn tribal leather, stitched by his late father years ago. Inside were dried, fragrant leaves of wild rooibos tea, harvested from the Cedarburg Mountains. It was the only piece of home Kofi carried with him in this cold, heartless city. Julian kicked a piece of broken porcelain toward Kofi's hand with a cold sneer. "Hurry up, garbage." Julian spat, turning his back on Kofi to greet the approaching security guards. "Ensure this filth stays out of the main hall during the summit." Kofi quietly gathered the broken pieces, his blood slowly mixing with the spilled tea on the floor. He knew he was completely helpless in their eyes. He had no degree, no power, no wealthy family, and no voice in this grand hotel. All he had was a father's desperate promise to keep his little girl alive. Kofi walked quietly down the narrow, dimly lit service corridor, leading to the basement staff room. The loud, cheerful chatter of wealthy hotel guests faded behind heavy fire doors. Down here the air was cold, damp, and smelled strongly of industrial bleach. Kofi sat down on a rickety wooden chair inside his small locker nook. He took out his mobile phone, its screen cracked across the top corner. He touched the screen with his calloused thumb to accept an incoming video call. A tiny, fragile face appeared on the screen, framed by a sterile hospital pillow. "Papa?" A soft, breathless voice whispered from the phone speaker. It was Amara, his 6-year-old daughter, wearing an oversized oxygen mask. Despite her pale skin and dark circles under her eyes, her face lit up with a warm smile. "Hello, my little brave heart," Kofi said, his harsh voice softening instantly. He carefully held the phone so she could not see the blood drying on his hand or his stained trousers. "How are you feeling today? Did you eat your warm porridge?" Amara nodded weakly, her tiny hand reaching out toward the phone screen, as if trying to touch him. "I ate it all, Papa. The doctor came today. He said my heart is very tired." She paused, taking a shallow, rattling breath that made Kofi's chest ache with unbearable pain. "He said I need the big operation soon. Will you be home for my birthday, Papa?" Kofi squeezed his eyes shut for a second, fighting back the hot tears burning behind his eyelids. 45,000 pounds. That was the price of his daughter's life. And right now, he was one mistake away from being thrown out onto the street with nothing. "I am working very hard, my sweet girl," Kofi promised, his voice trembling slightly. "Papa will get the money. The doctors will fix your heart, and then we will walk in the tea fields again." Amara smiled, reaching down to pick up a piece of paper beside her hospital bed. She held up a crude crayon drawing showing a large green tree and a steaming teacup. "I drew your magic tea, Papa," she murmured, her eyelids growing heavy with exhaustion. "The nurse said tea makes people happy. You are going to make everyone happy with your tea, right?" Kofi forced a gentle smile, nodding as tears finally spilled over his dark cheeks. "Yes, my darling. Papa's tea will fix everything. Now rest your eyes." After the call disconnected, Kofi held the cold phone against his forehead, weeping silently in the dark corridor. He was completely alone in this massive, unforgiving city. In the eyes of the hotel management, he was lower than the dust on their velvet carpets. Suddenly, the heavy metal door swung open with a loud, resounding bang. Julian stepped into the basement hallway, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply on the concrete. He looked down at Kofi with unbridled contempt, kicking the leg of Kofi's wooden chair. "Get up, scrub," Julian barked, holding a thick stack of white banquet tablecloths. "The main delegation has arrived early. You are on trash duty and heavy lifting in the kitchen." Kofi quickly stood up, wiping his wet face with the back of his sleeve. "Yes, Mr. Julian. Right away." "Don't look at me with those pathetic eyes," Julian sneered, tossing the heavy laundry pile at Kofi's chest. "If I see your face in the VIP hallway again before the banquet ends, I will call immigration. You people think you can come here and leech off our luxury. You don't belong in a place like this, Kofi. Remember your or I will destroy you." Julian turned on his heel and walked away, his loud laughter echoing down the concrete walls. Kofi stood holding the heavy linens, his jaws set tight, his chest heaving. He did not answer back. He could not afford to fight a man who held his daughter's life in his hands. He walked into the main kitchen pantry, where dozens of chefs were frantically preparing the grand feast. On a central stainless steel counter sat 6 large golden tins of Royal Imperial Golden Tea. Each tin was decorated with gold leaf, sealed with a red wax stamp, labeled at $10,000 per kilogram. It was touted as the rarest, most refined tea harvest in the entire world, imported exclusively for tonight. As Kofi walked past the prep table to dispose of the shipping crates, a sharp, bitter scent hit his nose. Kofi froze in his tracks. His father had taught him the art of wild tea harvesting since he was 7 years old. He knew the scent of pure tea leaves better than anyone in this entire building. Underneath the heavy artificial perfume of the luxury blend, Kofi smelled something dangerous. It was the distinct, sharp, chemical odor of synthetic preservatives and industrial coloring agents. The tea leaves had been chemically treated to look artificially bright and gold under display lights. When brewed at high temperatures, those chemical compounds would release toxic alkaline fumes. Kofi's heart skipped a beat. He knew instantly that if anyone drank this tea prepared with boiling water, it would cause severe allergic reactions. He looked toward Julian, who was bragging to a group of junior staff about procuring the rare blend. Kofi took a deep breath, stepped forward, and approached Julian cautiously. "Mr. Julian, sir," Kofi began, his voice low and respectful. Julian spun around, his expression instantly darkening into pure rage. "What did I tell you about speaking to me? Trash? Sir, please listen to me," Kofi urged, pointing toward the open gold tins. "The leaves in those tins, they have been treated with heavy chemical drying agents. If you pour boiling water over them, the steam will concentrate the toxins. It is dangerous to serve." The entire kitchen went dead silent. Chefs, sous-chefs, and waiters all turned to stare at the black room attendant in utter disbelief. Julian's face turned from red to deep purple. He took 2 large steps forward, grabbed Kofi by his collar, and slammed him against the stainless steel prep table. "Are you out of your mind?" Julian roared, his breath hot against Kofi's face. "You, a worthless toilet cleaner, are telling me about a $10,000 luxury tea blend? This tea was certified by European sommelier boards. Who the hell do you think you are?" "I am telling you the truth, sir," Kofi pleaded, his voice steady despite the physical threat. "In my home, we harvest tea leaves from the mountains. Chemical drying smells like bitter sulfur. Please test it." Julian slapped Kofi across the face with an open hand. The sharp crack echoed off the metal walls. Kofi's head snapped to the side, his lips bleeding open against his teeth. "One more word out of your dirty mouth, and I will have you dragged out in handcuffs." "Julian," he said, "get back to the trash dump where you belong." Julian shoved Kofi backward, sending him stumbling into the dishwashing station. Kofi stood among the dirty dishes, wiping the fresh blood from his lip. He had tried to warn them. He had tried to prevent a tragedy. But in their world, the truth meant nothing when it came from a man wearing a server's uniform. The massive crystal chandelier in the grand ballroom cast a blinding, brilliant light across the room. Long banquet tables were covered in fine white linen, heavy sterling silver cutlery, and hand-cut crystal glasses. In the center of the head table sat President Mbatha, the visiting head of state from South Africa. Surrounded by his top diplomatic aides and international journalists, the president conversed warmly with high-ranking hotel executives. Julian stood near the service entrance, wearing a spotless tuxedo and a broad, triumphant smile. Beside him sat a polished mahogany presentation box containing 6 gold-embossed porcelain teacups. Steam rose gently from the cups, carrying a rich, dark amber color into the air. "Distinguished guests, Honorable Mr. President," Julian declared, stepping forward with his voice booming gracefully through the microphone. Tonight, the Sovereign London Hotel is proud to serve you our rarest crown jewel, the Royal Imperial Golden Tea, harvested from exclusive high-altitude private estates. A tea reserved only for kings, emperors, and moments of great historic unity. President Mbata smiled warmly, raising his gold-rimmed porcelain cup toward the head of the diplomatic table. To unity, prosperity, and the bright future of our nations, the president announced proudly. The diplomats applauded loudly, raising their cups in unison and taking deep, appreciative sips of the steaming brew. At the edge of the grand service entrance, behind a heavy velvet curtain, Kofi stood motionless. His lip was still swollen and painful from Julian's violent blow, but he ignored the sting. His dark eyes were fixed entirely on President Mbata's hands as the leader swallowed the hot liquid. Kofi knew the truth that no one else in this lavish room cared to see. The tea leaves had been treated with synthetic, sulfur-based drying chemicals to artificially preserve their golden color. When exposed to boiling water above 90 degrees Celsius, those chemicals oxidized rapidly. They released a concentrated alkaline toxin that targeted the respiratory mucous membranes. In a healthy young person, it might cause mild stomach cramps or throat irritation. But Kofi had spent 3 weeks reviewing the president's public health profile while preparing the guest suites. He knew President Mbata suffered from severe, chronic respiratory asthma. To a man with that underlying condition, those invisible chemical fumes were a lethal catalyst. 5 seconds passed incomplete. Peaceful silence as the diplomats set their cups down on the linen table. Julian bowed deeply, basking in the polite applause of the elite audience. Then, without warning, President Mbata's hand began to tremble violently. Clatter. His gold-rimmed tea cup slipped from his fingers, crashing onto the mahogany table and spilling hot amber liquid everywhere. The president gasped, his chest heaving violently as he grabbed his throat with both hands. His eyes bulged with sudden, suffocating terror. His face turned from its warm bronze tone to a sickening, pale gray, then quickly to a deep, bruised purple. Mr. President, his chief security officer shouted, leaping from his chair as the room fell into utter chaos. He cannot breathe. President Mbata choked out, his voice a raspy, wheezing gasp. He fell sideways out of his chair, crashing heavily onto the carpeted floor. His legs thrashed weakly as he clutched his neck, his throat locking down tightly in an acute anaphylactic spasm. The grand ballroom erupted into sheer panic and screaming. Diplomats scrambled backward, knocking over chairs and glasses. Journalists began flashing cameras frantically, recording the historic disaster unfolding in real time. Julian stood rooted to the spot, his face drained of all color, his jaw hanging open in total shock. Get the medical team. Call an ambulancia now. The chief diplomat screamed at the top of his lungs. 2 personal presidential physicians rushed to the president's side, opening their emergency medical kits. They immediately jammed an oxygen mask over his face and administered an emergency epinephrine injection into his thigh. The heart monitor attached to his wrist beeped wildly, its alarm screaming at a terrifying frequency. His airway is completely swollen shut, the lead doctor shouted, his forehead dripping with nervous sweat. The adrenaline isn't breaking the chemical spasm. What did he consume? Julian stumbled backward, his voice shaking hysterically as he raised his trembling hands. It was just organic luxury tea. Certified tea. We didn't poison him. I swear, the ambulance is stuck in heavy rain traffic 20 minutes away. A security officer yelled into his radio. His heart rate is dropping. If we don't clear his trachea in 3 minutes, he will suffer fatal brain damage. President Mbatha's body went limp on the floor, his chest barely moving, his lips turning completely blue. The room had turned into a nightmare of screaming voices, flashing cameras, and hopeless panic. Behind the velvet curtain, Kofi's heart pounded against his ribs like a sledgehammer. He looked down at his own trembling hands. In his left pocket was his cracked phone, displaying the picture of his sick little daughter, Amara. In his right pocket was his father's worn leather pouch, filled with wild rooibos leaves. If he stepped into that room right now, Julian would scream that he was a criminal. The armed presidential bodyguards might tackle him to the ground or shoot him on the spot. If he was arrested, his job was gone, his visa was revoked, and Amara's life-saving surgery was cancelled forever. The safest choice was to stay behind the curtain, keep his mouth shut, and let the wealthy doctors handle it. It wasn't his fault. He had tried to warn Julian, and he had been beaten for it. He owed these arrogant people nothing. Kofi squeezed his eyes shut, his daughter's soft voice echoing in his mind. "You are going to make everyone happy with your tea, right, Papa?" Kofi opened his eyes. The fear in his face vanished, replaced by an unbreakable, steady resolve. His father had taught him that a true healer never turns his back on a dying human being to save himself. Kofi reached into his pocket, gripped the small tribal leather pouch tight in his palm, and pushed past the heavy velvet curtain into the blinding light of the ballroom. Kofi stepped through the heavy velvet curtain into the harsh, blinding light of the grand ballroom. The room was a hurricane of screaming voices, flashing press cameras, and total panic. Two personal physicians were kneeling over President Mbatha's limp body on the plush red carpet. The president's chest was frozen, his mouth open in a soundless, suffocating gasp. His face had turned a dark, bruised shade of purple as his swollen airway completely closed. His pulse is fading. The chief physician yelled, his hands covered in sweat as he pumped the president's chest. The emergency epinephrine shot failed. His throat is locked in an acute chemical spasm. Where is the emergency medical team? A high-ranking diplomat screamed, pulling his own hair in despair. Julian stood frozen near the banquet table, clutching his head, his face completely drained of color. I didn't do this. Julian whimpered hysterically, looking around at the furious bodyguards. It was certified tea, $10,000 a bottle. It's not my fault. Suddenly, Kofi pushed through the crowd of panicked diplomats, his boots heavy against the floor. "Move away from him," Kofi called out, his quiet voice cutting through the chaotic noise. "You are crowding his air. Stand back." Julian's eyes snapped toward Kofi, and his terror instantly transformed into pure, venomous rage. "You?" Julian shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Kofi's chest. "Security, grab this trash. He came here to sabotage the event. He poisoned the president." Four tall, heavily armed presidential bodyguards instantly drew their handguns and stepped toward Kofi. "Freeze! Get on the ground now!" The lead bodyguard shouted, racking the slide of his pistol. Kofi stopped dead in his tracks, but he did not raise his hands in surrender. He looked directly into the eyes of the lead bodyguard, his gaze steady, calm, and completely fearless. "If you shoot me, your president dies in less than 90 seconds, Kofi said loudly and clearly. "He is not suffering from a heart attack. He is dying from sulfur-alkaline chemical poisoning. The hot steam from that artificial tea burnt his bronchial lining and triggered a fatal respiratory lock." The chief physician paused, his chest compressions, his head snapping up to look at Kofi in absolute shock. "Sulfur-alkaline poisoning," the doctor muttered, staring at the president's blue lips. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I grew up in the tea fields of Cedarburg," Kofi declared, taking a slow step forward. I know the smell of chemical drying agents. I warned your director 15 minutes ago, and they hit me. The diplomats gasped loudly, turning their heads to glare at Julian. Julian turned pale, stumbling backward against a silver serving cart. He's lying. He's a toilet cleaner. He's a crazy peasant. Julian screamed, his voice cracking with panic. Look at his face. Look at his clothes. He knows nothing, son. Kofi ignored Julian completely. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his father's worn leather pouch. He unlaced the leather strap, revealing the dried, fragrant, reddish-brown leaves of wild rooibos. Modern medicine needs 2 hours to run blood tests, Kofi said, looking straight at the chief physician. You don't have 2 hours. You have 1 minute. Wild rooibos contains concentrated aspalathin and natural magnesium. When hallowed in water at 92 degrees, it acts as a rapid organic muscle relaxant and neutralizes alkaline toxins. It will unlock his tracheal muscle before his brain starves of oxygen. The chief physician looked at the dying president, whose heart rate monitor was letting out a long, continuous flatline beep. The doctor looked at Kofi's calloused hands, reading the absolute, unwavering conviction in the black man's eyes. Doctor, don't listen to this savage, Julian shrieked, grabbing the doctor's arm. He will kill him. Shut up, the physician roared, shoving Julian violently out of the way. The doctor grabbed the leather pouch from Kofi's hand, smelling the rich, clean, earthy aroma of pure mountain herbs. Prepare the water. The physician ordered the kitchen staff. 92 degrees. Now, Kofi didn't wait for the trembling kitchen staff. He stepped over to the hot water urn on the presentation table, checking the digital temperature readout. 92 degrees Celsius. Perfect. Kofi poured the pure hot water over a handful of wild rooibos leaves inside a clean glass beaker. Within seconds, the water transformed into a deep, rich, ruby-red liquid, releasing a soothing, sweet fragrance that filled the entire panicked hall. Kofi carried the steaming beaker back to the president's side and knelt down beside the chief doctor. Hold his jaw back, Kofi commanded softly. The doctor immediately obeyed, lifting President Mbatha's chin to open his mouth. Kofi carefully parted the president's swollen blue lips and poured a tiny, steady stream of the warm ruby tea down his throat. Silence fell over the grand ballroom like a heavy lead blanket. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic dripping of hot tea from the glass beaker onto the red carpet. Dozens of high-ranking diplomats, foreign dignitaries, and security personnel held their breath in utter shock. President Mbatha lay motionlessly on the floor, his swollen face still pale and dark purple. Kofi remained on his knees, his hands steady as he held the president's chin, watching the man's throat intently. Beside him, the chief physician squeezed his eyes shut, his hand trembling as he held the president's weak wrist. 10 seconds passed in agonizing, unbearable silence. Nothing is happening, Julian suddenly shrieked, his voice piercing through the quiet room like a serrated blade. He lied to you all. He's a dirty toilet cleaner who poured swamp water down the president's throat. Julian turned to the lead bodyguard, his face twisted with frantic excitement. Shoot him. Arrest him. He just assassinated a head of state in front of live cameras. The lead bodyguard raised his pistol once again, his finger tightening nervously on the cold metal trigger. Step away from the president now, server. The bodyguard barked through gritted teeth. Kofi did not flinch. He did not look up at the black barrel of the gun, aimed directly at his head. He kept his gaze fixed on President Mbatha's chest, counting the seconds in his heart. Wait. The chief physician suddenly gasped, his eyes flying open in sheer disbelief. The heart monitor attached to the president's wrist gave off a faint, rhythmic, beep, beep, beep. Suddenly, President Botha's chest heaved upward violently. A loud, deep, gasping intake of air erupted from his throat as his airway suddenly unlocked. Go! 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 The president thrashed slightly, rolling onto his side as he coughed up a small amount of dark, clear fluid. The bruised, purple coloration on his face instantly began to recede, replaced by a surge of warm, healthy red blood flow. His airway cleared. The physician shouted at the top of his lungs, his face flushed with ecstatic relief. The tracheal spasm has completely dissolved. Oxygen levels are rising back to 98%. The entire ballroom erupted into an explosion of gasps, cheers, and emotional applause. Diplomats wiped sweat from their foreheads, while foreign journalists snapped pictures of the miracle unfolding on the floor. President Botha slowly opened his eyes, taking deep, clean, steady breaths of air. He blinked through blurred vision, looking up into the calm, tired dark eyes of the African man kneeling above him. "You," President Botha whispered, his raspy voice trembling with emotion as he reached out a shaky hand. "You saved my life?" Kofi offered a small, humble bow, his voice quiet and gentle. "Rest now, Mr. President. The wild rooibos has neutralized the sulfur in your chest." The chief physician quickly placed a fresh oxygen mask over the president's face, then stood up and turned to face the room. He picked up the empty glass beaker containing Kofi's tea leaves, then walked over to the mahogany presentation table. He dipped a chemical test strip from his emergency kit into the spilled pool of Julian's $10,000 luxury tea. Within 3 seconds, the white test paper turned a dark, toxic black. "This is an outrage," the chief physician shouted, holding the black test strip high above his head for all the press cameras to see. "This expensive tea blend is heavily contaminated with concentrated industrial sodium sulfite. It was used as an artificial drying agent to make low-grade leaves look bright and golden. When mixed with boiling water, it created a concentrated chemical vapor that almost killed our president." The room turned instantly hostile. Dozens of furious diplomats and bodyguards turned their heads, their glare locking onto Julian like predatory hawks. Julian stood frozen against the banquet table, his knees knocking together violently, as his face turned as white as a bedsheet. I didn't know," Julian stammered hysterically, clutching his chest as cold sweat drenched his silk shirt. "The supplier promised me it was top quality. I was just trying to impress the board. You lied, you cheated, and you struck the man who tried to warn you," the physician declared furiously. If this brave man had not stepped forward with his native herbal knowledge, the president would be dead right now. At that moment, the heavy oak double doors of the ballroom slammed open. Sir Arthur Vance, the billionaire, owner and chairman of the global sovereign hotel group, strode into the room, surrounded by 6 senior police inspectors. Sir Arthur Vance, the billionaire chairman of the sovereign hotel group, stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room, taking in the chaotic scene, the trembling bodyguards, and the black test strip held high by the chief physician. Beside Sir Arthur stood 6 uniformed London police officers, their hands resting on their utility belts. "What is the meaning of this disaster?" Sir Arthur barked, his voice cold, heavy, and commanding. "I received an emergency alert that our state banquet was falling apart." Julian immediately broke away from the wall and dropped to his knees, crawling frantically toward Sir Arthur's polished shoes. "Sir Arthur, please, you must save us," Julian wailed hysterically, tears smearing the powder on his face. It was that African server, that toilet cleaner. Julian pointed a shaking finger toward Kofi, his voice shrieking with desperate panic. He brought illegal herbs into the hotel. He poisoned President Mbatha's tea. He tried to destroy our reputation. Arrest him. Toss him in jail forever. Sir Arthur looked down at Julian with utter disgust, then turned his gaze toward the chief physician and President Mbatha, who was slowly sitting up on the floor. The chief physician stepped forward, holding the black chemical test strip and a gold tin of Julian's luxury tea. Sir Arthur, your director is a liar and a fraud, the physician stated firmly, his voice echoing through the silent room. This expensive tea blend was laced with toxic sodium sulfite, preservatives. It caused President Mbatha's throat to completely lock in a life-threatening anaphylactic spasm. The doctor then gestured respectfully toward Kofi, who was standing quietly near the tea cart. If this man had not stepped forward and neutralized the toxin using pure Will Mountain Rooibos, President Mbatha would be dead. Your director tried to hide his mistake by assaulting this man 15 minutes before the banquet. Sir Arthur's face darkened into a storm of absolute fury. He turned his gaze to Julian, who was cowering on the floor like a beaten dog. Is this true, Julian? Sir Arthur hissed, his voice trembling with rage. Did you buy cheap, chemically treated garbage to inflate your department budget? Did you endanger the life of a head of state and assault an employee who tried to warn you? Julian couldn't form a sentence. He babbled incoherently, his face pale as death, drenching the carpet with sweat. Sir Arthur turned to the lead police officer beside him. Inspector, arrest this man immediately, Sir Arthur ordered coldly. Charge him with criminal negligence, endangerment of life, fraud, and physical assault. 2 police officers stepped forward, grabbed Julian by his collar, and yanked him up to his feet. Snap! The heavy steel handcuffs clicked tightly around Julian's wrists. No, Sir Arthur. Please, I have a family. Give me another chance. Julian's screamed, sobbing loudly, as he was dragged toward the exit. The diplomats and journalists watched in cold satisfaction as the arrogant director was hauled away in shame. Sir Arthur turned toward Kofi. He took off his leather gloves, walked across the ballroom, and stood directly in front of the quiet server. The billionaire looked at Kofi's swollen lip, his stained server trousers, and the worn leather pouch held gently in his calloused hands. Then, in front of live press cameras and high-ranking foreign dignitaries, Sir Arthur Vance did something that shocked everyone in the room. The billionaire bowed his head deeply to the humble African worker. On behalf of the Sovereign Hotel Group, I offer you my deepest, most sincere apologies, Sir Arthur said, his voice filled with profound respect. We treated a master of healing like an invisible servant. You saved a man's life today, and you saved this institution from utter ruin. President Mbatha stood up with the help of his bodyguards, walking over to stand beside Sir Arthur. The president placed his large, warm hand on Kofi's shoulder, looking into his eyes with deep gratitude. You carry the true spirit of our homeland in your heart, my brother, President Mbatha said softly. What is your name? Kofi stood tall, his dark eyes clear and steady. My name is Kofi, sir. I am a tea farmer from the Cedarburg Mountains. President Mbatha smiled warmly, turning to Sir Arthur. Sir Arthur, your hotel boasts of 6-star luxury, but the greatest treasure you have was sweeping your floors for minimum wage. Sir Arthur looked at Kofi, his expression filled with absolute determination. That ends today, Sir Arthur declared loudly. Kofi, as of this moment, you are appointed as the Global Director of Tea Experiences for our entire hotel chain. You will have complete authority over our beverage sourcing, a salary of £200,000 a year, and executive lodging. And we will partner directly with your native village in South Africa to source all our organic tea harvest. Kofi froze, his breath catching in his chest. £200,000. He didn't care about the fancy title or the executive lodging. That money meant Amara's £45,000 heart surgery was completely secured. His little girl was going to live. Tears spilled over Kofi's dark cheeks, but this time, they were not tears of humiliation or fear. They were tears of pure, overwhelming joy and relief. The echo of applause inside the grand ballroom faded into a heavy, thoughtful silence as Sir Arthur Vance shook Kofi's hand in front of dozens of flashing news cameras. To the world, watching through the reporters' lenses, it was the ultimate underdog fairy tale. A humble hotel room attendant saved a visiting foreign president with ancestral African tea and was instantly transformed into an executive with a £200,000 salary. Julian, pale and weeping, was led out of the grand foyer in heavy iron handcuffs by 3 London police officers. His ruined career, along with the exposed fraudulent tea supply chain, was already hitting the headlines across international news networks. Director of Tea Experiences, Kofi whispered to himself, staring down at the sleek gold hotel staff badge Sir Arthur had personally pinned to his lapel. It was more money than his entire family had seen in 3 generations of farming in the Cedarburg Mountains. Yet, as the wealthy hotel board members stepped forward to offer their artificial smiles and warm handshakes, Kofi felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He didn't care about the executive lodging, the tailored suits, or the prestige. His heart was 3 miles away, inside the cramped, sterile room of St. Jude's Children's Hospital, where 7-year-old Amara lay sleeping with an oxygen tube taped beneath her small nose. "Mr. Kofi," Sir Arthur said, stepping close and placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Our corporate car is waiting outside to take you to your new executive office. We will begin restructuring our beverage department immediately." "Sir Arthur, thank you," Kofi said softly, his deep voice thick with emotion. "I am grateful beyond words. But before I touch a single piece of paper in that office, I must go to my daughter. She needs £45,000 for her heart surgery before midnight tomorrow, or the doctors will cancel her place on the donor list." Sir Arthur smiled warmly, reaching into his inner suit pocket and pulling out a signed corporate check. "Your advance payment," Kofi, Sir Arthur said gently, placing the check into Kofi's trembling hands. £50,000. Go save your little girl." Kofi stared at the digits written on the check. Tears blurred his vision as he clutched the paper against his chest like a sacred shield. "Thank you. God bless you, Sir." Without waiting another second, Kofi sprinted out through the gilded glass doors of the hotel into the cold London rain, waving frantically for a taxi. 20 minutes later, Kofi's heavy boots echoed down the quiet, white hallway of St. Jude's Hospital. He held the check tightly in his pocket, his pulse racing with intense relief. He could finally walk into Dr. Evans' office, pay the deposit in full, and tell Amara that she was going to live. He reached room 3, gently pushing the door open. Inside, 7-year-old Amara was sitting up in the hospital bed. Her skin was still dangerously pale, but her dark eyes lit up the moment she saw her father step through the door. Clutched tightly in her tiny hands was the wooden tea leaf she had carved for him. "Papa," Amara gasped softly, her voice weak but full of pure joy. "You came back." Kofi rushed to the bedside, dropping to his knees and wrapping his arms gently around his daughter's frail frame, kissing her forehead over and over again. "I'm here, my beautiful little leaf. Papa is here." "Papa, why are you crying?" Amara asked, wiping a tear from his dark cheek with her thumb. "Did the bad manager yell at you again?" "No, Amara, no one is yelling anymore." Kofi choked back a sob. pulling the 50,000-pound check from his coat. "Look at this. Papa got the money. You are going to have your surgery. You are going to run in the green fields again." Amara didn't understand the numbers on the paper, but she understood the look in her father's eyes. She wrapped her small arms around his neck, resting her head against his shoulder. "I knew you would fix it. Papa, you always fix everything." Just then, the heavy door opened, and Dr. Evans stepped into the room, holding a thick medical clipboard. His expression was solemn, devoid of any warmth. "Mr. Kofi," Dr. Evans said flatly, "I see you're back. I hope you haven't come to negotiate again. We have a line of paying patients waiting for that operating theater." Kofi stood up straight, wiping his eyes, and proudly held out the corporate check. "Dr. Evans, here is 50,000 pounds. Signed by Sir Arthur Vance of the Sovereign Hotel Group. It is more than enough for Amara's deposit and treatment." Dr. Evans glanced at the check, then raised an eyebrow with a cold, dismissive sneer. He didn't even reach out to take the paper. "A corporate check?" Dr. Evans scoffed, crossing his arms. "Mr. Kofi, this hospital's policy regarding emergency donor allocation requires cleared electronic bank transfers or certified bank drafts. We do not accept third-party corporate checks from unverified accounts on 24 hours' notice." Kofi's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? This is from the chairman of the Sovereign Hotel Group. It takes 3 business days for a check of this amount to clear through clearing banks," Dr. Evans replied coldly, checking his watch. "Amara's window for the heart transplant surgery closes at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. If cleared funds are not in our hospital account by then, her spot goes to Lord Sterling's grandson." 3 days? Kofi gasped, his voice cracking with sheer horror. "She doesn't have 3 days. She has 16 hours. Then I suggest you find a way to get cash or a cleared transfer before sunrise." "Mr. Kofi," Dr. Evans said coldly, turning toward the door. "Rules are rules. Medical priority belongs to those who can secure the resources." Kofi stood frozen in the center of the sterile room as the doctor walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. The 50,000-pound check felt weightless and useless in his trembling hand. He had the wealth. He had the vindication. Yet, the cold bureaucracy of the world was still threatening to tear his daughter away from him. Kofi turned back to look at Amara, who was watching him with wide, worried eyes. He forced a brave, loving smile onto his face, knelt down, and kissed her small hands. "Don't worry, Amara," Kofi whispered, his eyes blazing with absolute determination. "Papa is not giving up." Kofi stood under the flickering fluorescent light in the hallway of St. Jude's Hospital, looking at the useless 50,000-pound check in his hands. The paper was signed by a billionaire, yet the cold, rigid hospital policy rendered it completely powerless against the clock. Inside room 304, little Amara had drifted back to sleep, her tiny body trembling slightly under the coarse white blanket. The digital clock on the wall read 9:45 p.m. 8 hours. And 15 minutes remained before the surgical schedule locked and the donor heart was transferred to another family. Kofi wiped a cold bead of sweat from his forehead, his dark eyes hardening with resolute focus. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his worn mobile phone, and dialed Sir Arthur Vance's direct executive line. The line rang twice before the billionaire answered. "Kofi?" Sir Arthur's voice came through, clear and alert. "Is everything all right? Did you reach the hospital?" "Sir Arthur, I need your help," Kofi said, his voice quiet, heavy, but unwavering. "The hospital management refuses to process a corporate check on short notice. Their system requires cleared bank transfers or verified cash deposit before 8:00 a.m. If the money is not in their account by sunrise, they will give Amara's transplant slot to another patient. There was a sudden, sharp silence on the line, followed by the sound of Sir Arthur's heavy footsteps across his private study. "They refuse my signature?" Sir Arthur hissed, his voice cold with aristocratic authority. "Who is the chief administrative officer handling this case?" "Dr. Evans, sir," Kofi replied. "He said policy cannot be broken for unverified corporate papers. Dr. Evans will learn tonight that the Sovereign Hotel Group does not make empty promises," Sir Arthur stated firmly. "Stay beside your daughter, Kofi. I am calling the bank chairman personally to execute an instant wire transfer."